You are listening to the Beyond Canon podcast.
Dear listeners, friends and fellows, welcome very much to the next episode of our Center for Advanced Studies Beyond Canon podcast. My name is Charlotte von Schelling and I am the editorial assistant at Beyond Canon. And it is my extraordinarily great pleasure to welcome our next guest in the podcast, who is Professor Janet Spitler, the Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia in the United States. Janet, we are so happy that you agreed to be a part of our podcast series. We miss you dearly since after such a long time that you were lucky enough, and also we were lucky enough, that you spent here more than a year. It's so nice to have you again as a conversation partner. And maybe as an introduction, I would suggest that we could just start with you introducing yourself to our listeners and tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. It's so nice to be with you, Charlotte. I miss being there in person, but it's nice to see your face here and hear your voice. So, like you said, I just came back to the United States after spending about 18 months in Regensburg at the Beyond Canon Center, which was wonderful despite COVID. We had a really good time in spite of the pandemic. So usually, like you said, I'm a professor at the University of Virginia in our Department of Religious Studies. Before that, I taught at Texas Christian University for a bit, and I studied at the University of Chicago, where my dissertation advisors were Hans-Josef Klauck and Margaret Mitchell.
Maybe I would suggest we just dig into our topic, which is, of course, Apocrypha and everything that's beyond canon. How did you come to deal with the topic of Apocrypha in the first place?
So I came to early Christian studies via classics, Greek philology. To me, the distinction between canonical literature and non-canonical literature was not such a big deal in the beginning. So I think I sort of arrived at apocryphal literature kind of naturally. When I started graduate studies at the University of Chicago, I remember taking a seminar on the Apocryphal Acts with Hans-Josef Klauck, who was currently writing a short book on the Apocryphal Acts at the time, and I just loved the material. So once I read these stories, which I was completely unfamiliar with, they were just so much fun and so interesting that I dug in and I kind of never looked back.
That sounds really interesting. So the next question is actually not only one that I have for you, but a couple of questions. I'm sure you can give the perfect answers to these. The first one would be, how many apocryphal acts do we have?
Many. many. So I think if listeners are familiar with the Apocryphal Acts at all, they've probably heard of what we sometimes call the Big Five. So the Acts of Paul, Acts of Peter, Acts of Andrew, Acts of John, and Acts of Thomas. And these are, major Apocryphal Acts that seem to have been, well, some of them fairly popular in the late antique period, but there's actually many more than that. And also these stories about individual apostles, they expand over time. So we don't have just one Acts of Thomas, we have multiple Acts of Thomas, and we don't have just one Acts of Paul, we also have the Acts of Paul and Thecla, and the Acts of Peter and Paul, etc., etc. So really, you might think that with the Apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, you might be limited to 12 texts, but there really are many more than that, and the genre really expands over time, and essentially it develops kind of into hagiography.
So could we also answer the questions, who wrote them and for whom?
No. so not so much. I would say that really the Apocryphal Acts are anonymous. So we don't know the names of authors.
Okay.
We do have some texts. So for example, the Acts of John by Prochorus. You feel like you have this author named, right? By Prochorus, but in
yes,
fact,
exactly.
Right, yeah, but he's actually a first-person narrator within the text. So we don't think that this is the author of the text.
Yes.
This is a character within the text who is the narrator. But no, we don't know the names of any authors specifically attached to these texts. In terms of for whom they're written, this is always a tricky question. Of course, we're making guesses. But one thing that we can say is that these texts were, sometimes we can tell where they were consumed from manuscripts themselves. So, for example, we know that these texts were read sometimes in liturgical contexts, sometimes at monasteries. Mm-hmm. So we do have some clues specifically about who was actually reading these texts. Mm-hmm. In terms of for whom they were composed, there have been various specific guesses. Sometimes scholars have noted the prominence of female characters in these texts and thought, well, maybe they were composed for women. Sometimes because they're they're full of adventure that people think might have appealed to a popular audience. They think, oh, these were written for ordinary people.
Oh, that sounds cool.
Yeah, and those things may or may not be accurate, but I think that we can't say for sure, but we can talk a little bit more about the evidence that we have for how these texts were consumed. And there we have a little bit of evidence.
We're going to get back to one thing you mentioned already, which are the Acts of John by Prochorus. But before, maybe one last general question, that would be, which apocryphal acts would you say were majorly influential in early and later Christian communities, after all that you've mentioned?
Yeah, so some we have lots of manuscripts, right, which indicates a little bit more popularity. So the Acts of Thomas seems to be one that was popular. And frequently the end part of these texts, the martyrdom accounts of the apostles, tend to be a little bit more popular. But then also texts like, for example, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, or sometimes we just call it the Acts of Thecla, this adventure of this famous woman apostle. We can see its influence also in the way that later biographies of Christian women seem to be sort of modeled after this account of Thecla. So we can see the popularity and the sort of continuing influence of the text in that way.
Thank you so much. That was a great insight in general, but maybe to a more personal level. Next question would be, what is your personal specific research interest?
I particularly like these Acts of John. This is a particular apocryphal act that has really spun out in multiple directions, so that we have a variety of texts dealing with John that are related to each other in complicated ways. And what I really like about this sort of complex of texts, or sort of library of Johannine texts, is that it really gives us insight into how literature worked for early Christians. Sometimes I tell my students that early Christians, if nothing else, were writers, that they wrote texts, which isn't necessary for a religion. Do you know what I mean? Religions don't have to be text-based, and religious people don't have to produce more and more text, but Christians really did. And I think what's interesting with these apocryphal acts is you really get a sense of how a text develops over time, how it changes, how it's adapted for different generations of Christians, how it's used, how it's changed, how they're sometimes left behind. And so I think that this really just gives us a really neat view into how texts and literature, and particularly narratives, worked for successive, centuries of Christianity.
That sounds extremely exciting. And we actually also know that you're currently working on a commentary on the Acts of John, and also a translation of the aforementioned Acts of John by Prochorus. So of course we are eager to know more about the text and what it has to do with the idea of Beyond Canon that is so extremely important to our center here.
So I'm working on the commentary on the Acts of John, and this is a text that was popular briefly, I would say, but was specifically condemned by the church, and particularly at the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. The Orthodox Christianity really kind of put the kibosh on the Acts of John. But, so this text is not preserved on its own. It's only preserved in fragments or sections that are embedded in later texts, primarily the Acts of John by Prochorus. Now, this is a related Acts of John text, but this one was very popular. So we have this in about 150 manuscripts. And so this was a narrative that I think certainly in the English-speaking world, almost totally unknown, but was very popular and influential throughout the late antique and Byzantine and medieval periods. So this sort of, again, this complex of texts is really interesting to me for a lot of ways. It shows how, it's sort of this Johannine library of texts shows, it includes texts that were, like I said, condemned, at the same time texts that are closely related that were extremely popular. And we see all of these different traditions about John sort of bumping into each other and breaking apart and expanding over a millennium. So that I think this is really neat. And it also includes lots of really fun stories about John.
So fun aspect doesn't come too short on this.
Exactly.
It's always nice to keep going, to keep doing research. And what would you say, what specific things are we going to be able to learn from these apocryphal acts? And also, why should we spend time thinking about them?
So because we have these layers of texts and we can see how it develops over time, this really shows us what Christians of different periods were worried about, were concerned with, were thinking about, and also enjoyed reading. So it's sort of, so this one kind of body of texts can allow us to really sort of dig through and see what Christians of various periods were thinking about, what they cared about. So that aspect I think is really important. And I also think that some of these texts were very popular at particular periods and then largely forgotten, I think, to contemporary Christians. But I think that there's a lot of value in them. I think that they're fun, but they also include lots of serious theological content and thinking through of theological problems and social problems. And so I think that there's lots of just valuable material in there, and they certainly deserve to, see the light of day.
Wow, so we can be extremely excited about what we're doing further on with this research. And yes, we'll see. You're planning to publish a book about that, or are you able to say that already?
Yes. So the translation of the Acts of John by Prochorus will appear in the More New Testament Apocrypha, Volume 2, edited by Tony Burr. So that will, I think that'll appear relatively soon, although I have to finish my translation, right? And then I'm also working on the commentary, and that may or may not be a 2-volume bit. With some
wow.
Also.
Great things that are in sight right now. Okay, so far to all of your research you're doing, but maybe you could also tell us a little bit about the time you spent in Regensburg. We already talked about the fact that you actually spent with your whole family, luckily, over a year at the Beyond Canon Center. So what would you say overall? How did it go? And what can you say about your experiences here?
I think that one characteristic of studying apocryphal literature as opposed to canonical literature is that it's extant in a huge variety of languages across multiple periods of time. So much so that I feel like an individual scholar working on her own just can't do it all. Do you know what I mean? Nobody has all of those languages. Nobody is a master of all of those sources. So I think that when you're studying apocryphal literature, it really has to be a team sport. So you have to work together. And that's when I think the best thing about the Beyond Canon Institute, besides how fun and exciting and friendly everybody is, but having people there who are experts in Coptic literature, experts in Armenian literature, etc. Yeah, Slavic. I mean, to have all of these things, to bring all of these people together with different fields of expertise and just different skills. I think that that's what this body of literature requires. And so you really have to have something like the Beyond Canon Center. And then to put it in beautiful Regensburg with friendly people, yeah, this is ideal.
Thank you so much. That was great advertising for our project here. So everybody who's going to listen to this, come here. It's great. We have witnesses for that. And we want everyone to be back here, whoever had to leave after a longer or a shorter stay here. And we can give that back because everyone who visited us here has been such a great pleasure to get to know. And hopefully that will continue despite the terrible situation of the pandemic. We have a certain time frame for our interviews here, and unfortunately, we have already reached the last question, which is also, once again, on a more general basis, and that would be, what advice could you give students looking to do research in biblical studies or early Christianity and Judaism?
So I guess related to the Beyond Canon Center, I would say make good friends, find good partners, good colleagues to work with, I think. I think it's also important to think of yourself as a lifelong language learner, so don't limit yourself to the languages that you learned in high school or college, right? To be picking up both modern and ancient languages. But honestly, I really do think that that finding good colleagues in adjacent fields, people who want to work together, I think this is really key. I think this is maybe the most important thing. So yeah, find yourself some good friends like I did in Regensburg.
That's perfect, Janet. Yes, you could actually say that working here is working among a family. And it's also great to hear that from people who've been here, who come back here, because you will.
Absolutely.
In a couple of months, hopefully it'll all go well. And so, yeah, the last thing I'm gonna say here is thank you so much for the nice talk. Maybe if you are gonna start working on another book, we have you back here a second time being an interviewee at our podcast. So for now, for us here, the working day is nearing its end, but for you, you're just about to start. It's early morning in Virginia. So have a nice day. And once again, thank you so much, Janet, for being our guest here.
Thanks, Charlie. It's good to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to the Beyond Canon podcast.